no longer convinced that the God of Plato could be successfully wedded with the God of the Bible. So we have these main players. We have Arius, we have Alexander, and we have Athanasius, along with the Emperor Constantine, of course. These had come to believe a doctrine that would have startled any Platonist. They considered that God had created the world out of nothing, ex nihilo, basing their opinion on Scripture. Well, in fact, Armstrong says, Genesis had not made this claim. The priestly author of Genesis had implied that God had created the world out of the primordial chaos. This is the Hebrew tohu vavohu. He did not summon the whole universe from an absolute vacuum. This is what was entirely new with the Council of Nicaea. It was alien to Greek thought, and it had not been taught by such theologians as Clement and Origen, who had held the Platonic scheme of emanation. Well, by the 4th century, though, Christians shared the Gnostic view of the world as inherently fragile and imperfect, and so on and so forth. It was separated from God by a vast chasm. The new doctrine of creation ex nihilo emphasized this view of the cosmos as quintessentially frail and utterly dependent upon God for being and for life. God and humanity were no longer akin as they were in Greek thought. God summoned every single being from an abysmal nothingness, and at any moment he could withdraw his sustaining hand. There was no longer a great chain of being emanating eternally from God. There was no longer an intermediate world of spiritual beings who transmitted the divine manna to the world. In other words, men and women could no longer ascend the chain of being to God by their own efforts. Now, the Christians knew that Jesus Christ had saved them from death and hell, and they were going to be resurrected. They had been redeemed from extinction, and they would one day share the existence of God. And this existence of God, of course, included being and life itself. Somehow Christ had enabled them to cross the gulf that separated God from humanity. They understood all this already, see? The question was, how had he done it? On which side of the great divide was he? There was now no longer a pleroma, that is, a place of fullness, with intermediaries and vast eons and so on and so forth. Either Christ, the Word, belonged to the divine realm, which was now the domain of God alone, or he belonged to the fragile created order. Arius and Athanasius put him on opposite sides of the gulf. This is why there was a dispute. Athanasius put God in the divine world. Arius put him in the created order, that is, the Son of God. Arius wanted to emphasize the essential difference between the unique God and all of his creatures. As he wrote to Bishop Alexander, God was the only begotten, the only eternal, the only one without beginning, the only true, the only one who has immortality, the only wise, the only good, the only potentiate. Arius knew the Scriptures well, and he produced an armory of texts to support his claim that Christ, the Word, could only be a creature like we are. You see, he put him on the created order, and this offended Alexander and his pupil Athanasius to no end. They said, nothing doing, pal. And each one of them brought forth scriptures that demonstrated their point. This is the interesting thing. Each one of them had the scriptures to back up their potential claim. Arius passionately believed that Christians had been saved and made divine, sharers in the nature of God. But this was only possible because Jesus had blazed a trail for us. He had lived a perfect human life. He had obeyed God even unto the death of the cross, as St. Paul said. It was because of this obedience unto death that God had raised him up, to an especially exalted status. This was the reasoning of Arius here now. If Jesus had not been a human being, there would be no hope for us. There would have been nothing meritorious in his life if he had been God by nature. In other words, there's nothing for us to imitate. It was by contemplating Christ's life of perfectly obedient sonship that Christians would become divine themselves. By imitating Christ, the perfect creature, they too would become unalterable and unchangeable, perfect creatures of God. Athanasius, on the other hand, he had a less optimistic view of man's capacity for God. It was only by participating in God through his logos that man could avoid annihilation, because God alone was a perfect being. So if the logos himself were a vulnerable creature, he would not be able to save mankind from extinction. The logos had been made flesh in order to give us life. He had descended into the mortal world of death and corruption in order to give us a share of God's impassibility and immortality. But this salvation would have been impossible if the Logos himself had been a mere frail creature. See, this was Athanasius' point of view. This is where they fought and argued constantly. Christ could not himself lapse back into nothingness as a creature. That was absurd. Only he who had created the world could save it, and that meant that Christ, the Logos made flesh, he must be the same nature as the Father. As Athanasius said, the Word became man in order that we could become divine. So the showdown came when they gathered at Nicaea, May 20th, 325. They wanted to resolve this crisis. Very few would have shared Athanasius' view of Christ, incidentally. Most held a position somewhere between them both, actually. There was a middle view. And this was shown in the makeup of the groups of the bishops. The vast majority of them were just kind of almost non-committal at this Council of Nicaea. Only Arius and his two brave companions refused to sign the creed. This made creation ex nihilo an official Christian doctrine for the first time. Now, this is 325 A.D. This is according to Karen Armstrong in her History of God, page 111. I'm taking the majority of this from here. The Creator and the Redeemer were one. Now, when they finally came to agree, this pleased the emperor, Armstrong says. She says, the emperor had no understanding of the theological issues, and there's other authors I have that will share that, definitely. Even some of the early church fathers say that. I've got some great quotes from them that I've looked up too. Well, he had no understanding of the theological issues. In fact, there was no unanimity at Nicaea. After the council, the bishops went right on teaching as they had before. The Arian crisis continued for another 60 years. Arius and his followers fought back and managed to regain imperial favor. And you can read about this in the early church fathers too. It's fascinating how they had so much intrigue, and they were constantly going behind each other's backs and trying to subvert the other bishop. It's an astonishing picture. Athanasius was then exiled. See, the emperor took Athanasius aside. But then later on, Arius was accepted in, and Athanasius was exiled. And he was exiled no fewer than 5 different times. It was very difficult to make his creed stick. In particular, the reason why, of course, is his very famous Greek word, homoousian. Literally means made of the same stuff. This was controversial because, of course, it was unscriptural. It was not a term used in the Bible. Now, this is interesting. They had to resort to using a non-biblical term to describe the biblical God. You see, this is part of the problem that the Arians had. And it had materialistic association. Thus, 2 copper coins could be said to be homoousian because both derived from the same substance, you see. Well, further, Athanasius' creed begged many important questions. It stated that Jesus was divine, but it didn't explain how the Logos could be of the same stuff as the Father without being a second God. So in 339, Marcellus, the